So today we are continuing through our story of the Bible, right? Last week we covered Genesis chapters 1 through 5, and this week we are starting with Genesis 6, and we are going to go as far as we can during this 2-hour time period. We might go a little bit over since I did a little bit extra talking at the end, at the beginning, but we'll see. I'm just going to pray for us real quick, and then we're going to hop in. Sound good? Mm-hmm. Dear Lord, thank you so much for allowing us to be here today. We praise you. We thank you. We ask that you would guide us as we go into your word. Lord, the fact that you would reveal yourself to us is an amazing thing. I pray that you would give us ears to hear the things that you've written down. That as we go through these stories, we won't just be entertained and that we won't just grow intellectually, God. That these won't just be activities in pride or activities in pleasure, God. But that really this will be an opportunity for growth. That we will do this and we will walk through this big overview of the Bible really so that we can grow in you, so that we can be better equipped to go out and serve you as leaders in the church, leaders in the community, God. That's really what we want to do. Not for the sake of leadership, God, but for the sake of service. So help shape us tonight, God. Help us understand your story so we can also figure out where we fit into it. And may you receive the glory through our time together. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so Genesis chapter 6. Just as a brief recap of what we covered last week, Genesis chapter 1 was the creation of the heavens and the earth. Genesis chapter 2, we got to see that upon creating the heavens and the earth, God put man and woman into a garden where they were married and they were dwelling with God. Genesis chapter 3, we got to see the inciting incident where everything fell apart. Right? We got to see sin enter the world, man and woman kicked out of the garden, which led to Genesis chapter 4, where we got to see a second fall story. And we got to see that the enmity between the woman and the serpent is not a one-time thing, right? It's an ongoing generational thing, right? And so we got to see the whole conflict between Cain and Abel, and how Cain ultimately was confronted by God, and how Cain chose the path of the serpent, right? That leads us to Genesis chapter 5. Genesis chapter 5 gives us a genealogy, and this is where we closed off last week. And in this genealogy, we talked about how it's really kind of depressing, because as the genealogy goes, you realize that these people are living a lot longer than we live today, right? Some of them are living 900-something years, and their entire lives are relegated to nothing more than simply living a few years, having some kids, dying, right? And that's really depressing. And I think you're supposed to feel kind of depressed as you read chapter 5 because you're realizing that something is wrong in the world. And I think that almost every single chapter of the Bible after Genesis chapter 3 is supposed to give you that feeling. Right? From Genesis chapter 3, you have this promise that there's going to be this seed to show up to crush the serpent. Right? And that one day God is going to redeem humanity and he's going to restore the world. Right? He's going to restore creation. Mm-hmm. And going forward, as we read every chapter of the Bible, what we're supposed to be crying out is we're supposed to be crying out, "Come, Lord." Right? Please, come, Lord. Right? The phrase that the early church would adopt for this was Maranatha. Right? Come, Lord. Come, Lord. Come, Lord. Right? But this is something that really the Maranatha cry begins in Genesis 3, and it permeates every chapter of the Bible after that. As you encounter human brokenness, as you encounter sin, as you encounter all these sorts of wicked things, you're supposed to be crying out, "Come, Lord. Come, Lord. Come, Lord." And when you get to Genesis 5, there's only one ray of hope in the whole thing. Well, really 2 rays of hope. Right? The first ray of hope comes with a guy named Enoch. Right? He's the one person who breaks the pattern. Right? And he lives, and he has kids, but then he does not die. Because it says he walks with the Lord, and then he was not. Right? And that's one ray of hope, because you're like, ooh, interesting. Right? So apparently walking with God is the key to breaking the pattern of really depression and sadness. And the Maranatha cry is solved by walking with God. And then the second ray of hope comes at the very end of chapter 5, where this guy named Lamech has a child. And he names the child Noah. And that's because the name Noah means rest. And he prophesies that this child will bring rest to the ground which God had cursed. And that is going to happen. Right? And what we're going to see in these next 3 chapters are we're going to see a foreshadowing of the ultimate restoration that's going to come at the end of days. Right? I've talked about how, redemption and restoration, that is the story of the Bible. And we're going to see foretastes of redemption and restoration before the actual thing happens. Right? So we get a foretaste of the restoration here in the Great Deluge, right? The Great Flood, right? And then it's ultimately going to be fulfilled in the book of Revelation whenever God remakes the heavens and the earth, right? When he recreates it and restores it, right? We're going to get a foretaste of the redemption whenever Jesus dies on the cross, right? Whenever he actually satisfies the sin debt, but the devil himself isn't going to be crushed until we get to, once again, Revelation, right? And so we're getting foretastes of these, but it's still not going to solve the story, right? And so Genesis 5, you feel that ache, you feel that yearning for restoration and for redemption, and then this child named Noah is born. And so you've got to remember Noah for a second, but then what we're going to do is we're going to cut back, and Genesis 6 begins by telling us how bad things have gotten. Now it happened when man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were good in appearance, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Then Yahweh said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he indeed is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. Right? And so God basically says, things are not going well. There's sin permeating the entire creation, and he basically sets a 100-year timeline. In 120 years, flesh is going to end. Sometimes people mistakenly interpret this as saying that man will not live past 120 years. But if you keep reading the story, you're going to see that there's plenty of other examples just in Genesis of people living past 120 years. So it seems like God is making this proclamation 120 years before the actual flood's going to happen. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Now, those 4 verses right there are some of the most intriguing and complex verses in the entire Bible. We're not going to have time to break them down right now because it really wouldn't benefit us from an overview perspective to break it all down. There's plenty of different interpretations. I have my own interpretation. The main thing you need to know, and you can pick this up from just the language, is that something unnatural is occurring here. Right? There's some sort of sexual union that is taking place between whatever the sons of God are and whatever the daughters of man are that is not according to God's natural design. Right? Once again, there's plenty of different theories about it. We don't need to get into it. The main thing is that it's unnatural and therefore not good. Rocky, welcome, my friend. And so there's this unnatural union that's going on. And as a result, God says, I am not going to allow this to continue on. Right? Because God is patient. He is merciful. He is slow to anger. He will allow things to go on for a while. But eventually he says, this is not going to work. And so we continue reading and we see that God has a solution that he's going to lay out. Then Yahweh saw that the evil of man was great on earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Just think about that. Every intent of the thoughts of his heart, only evil continually. Like every word there accentuates how bad things are, right? Every intent, right? Notice that intent isn't simply talking about action. It's talking about desires. It's talking about motives, right? So every single motive of man. But it's not even every motive of his heart. It's every motive of the thought of his heart, right? If your heart was able to think, that's how evil man's thoughts have become. Every intent of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. Not just evil continually, only evil continually. Man had become permeated by sin. All he wanted to do was do evil and accomplish evil. Well, this is not good, right? Remember, this is why God kicked man out of the Garden of Eden. Right? Because man had chosen sin, and God said, I cannot allow sin to exist forever. And so lest man eat from the tree of life and live forever, he kicks him out. Right? God is very merciful, but there's a certain point where God says, okay, this will not do. Because he designed things to be good, right? Remember Genesis 1? It was good, it was good, it was good, it was good, it was very good. Well, now everything's evil. And so he says, this is not what I designed things to be like. And so what he's going to want to do is he's going to want to hit a reset button, right? And so we read, and Yahweh regretted that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. I want you to notice once again, this is not an easy thing for God, right? Many people will look at this story, and they will think about the great flood as if God is just some evil dictator in the sky who just can't wait to wipe people out. That's not how the story presents itself, right? This is a creator who is sad at what he's created, right? And this isn't God, like whenever it says he regretted it, I don't want you to think that God wishes he could take it back, right? We've got to realize that this is the Bible anthropomorphizing God, where it is describing the almighty creator of the universe according to terms humans can understand, right? So it's not God saying, I want to take it back, because the thing is, God knew this would come, right? It's saying, it's kind of like whenever you know something's going to come, but it doesn't take away the pain from seeing it happen. Right? That's what he's experiencing.
Okay.
Right? It's one thing to know something's going to happen, but whenever you see it playing out before you, it's horrible.
Just witnessing the event, right?
Yeah. I mean, and you're going to see this again with the prophets, right? Whenever God allows the prophets to see some of the future, they're going to say this is what's going to happen, but then whenever they actually see it happening, they're going to weep. Right? And that's what God's experiencing right here. And it's not him rejoicing in having to destroy creation, because would Leonardo da Vinci rejoice in tearing up the Mona Lisa? No. Would Michelangelo rejoice in tearing down the statue of David? No. Right? Why would an artist rejoice in destroying their creation? They wouldn't. Right? So God is grieved by this. He doesn't want to do this, but man has given him no choice because man has chosen evil. And so what he's going to do is he's going to send a flood. And Yahweh said, I will blot out man with whom I have created from the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and the birds of the sky, for I regret I have made them, but Noah found favor in the eyes of Yahweh. Right? And so this is where it brings us back to that Noah guy. Right? So God says, man is destroying creation. I'm going to wipe out man in order to fix things. And Noah is the guy through whom God is going to help fix things. Right? And so what we're going to see over the next 3 chapters, really those first few verses there set up the whole thing to where you can understand it. The next 3 chapters are sad. They are sad, sad stories, and one of the most frustrating things to me is whenever I walk into a Sunday school room and I see like that happy little picture of like Noah, and like Noah with all the animals in the boat, and they're all so happy and smiling, and there's like a rainbow in the background. That's frustrating to me because from a young age, we're teaching these kids the wrong story. Yeah. The reason why, think about how fast everything's been progressing so far, right? Creation of the world, the universe, 1 chapter. Paradise, 1 chapter. The fall of man, 1 chapter. The generation after man, 1 chapter. 2,000 years of generations, 1 chapter. All of a sudden, for the flood, 3 chapters. Right? All of a sudden, we've hit the slow-mo button. Right? And it's slowed down because the author wants us to recognize how instrumental these moments are. Right? And the author doesn't want us to just jump to the happy rainbow at the end. Because the thing is, you need to understand the rainbow's significance, and the only way you can understand the rainbow's significance is by understanding how sad the events that take place here are. Right? And so as you go through this, God says, I'm going to wipe out man. But what he resolves to do is he resolves to save Noah and his family. Noah has 3 sons. Their names are Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Right? Noah and his 3 sons are all married. So all in all, that's how many people?
3 3 plus 2 is 5.
1 plus 3 is 4. And if they're each married, that would be 8. Very good. 8 people, right? Math.
I don't know why I couldn't do it.
Yes. So there's 8 people, right? And God basically tells Noah to build this really big boat, right? The word in Hebrew is teba, right? And it's the same word used to describe the basket Moses is put into in the book of Exodus. It's basically just like a box, right? It's not like, whenever we think boat, we think something to like sail the 7 seas. This is not a vessel that you go sailing in, right? This box solely exists to keep people alive. It just floats, right? Yeah, you don't go sailing, you don't do anything like that. It is simply designed to keep people alive, right? And so he gives Noah all these dimensions and stuff like that, and it tells us that Noah obeyed God. And let me see if I can find the exact verse where that happens. It's the last verse of chapter 6. Thus Noah did, according to all that God had commanded him, so he did. What I love about this is the very first time we actually see somebody being obedient in the Bible. Right? All the other times God has confronted somebody, they've disobeyed. Right? He talks to Adam and Eve disobey. He talks to Cain disobeys. He talks to Noah, and he gives Noah more specific details than he's given anybody else, yet Noah obeys. This tells you what type of man Noah is. Right? Noah is a righteous man, and you get to see why God chose him. Right? He says, Noah, go do this, and Noah does it. Right? He builds this amazingly large vessel. He fills it with all these animals. And then sure enough, when you get to chapter 7, everybody gets in the boat, God seals the door, and the rains start pouring. And the main thing that I want you to know about this, right, is that ultimately they're going to be on this boat for like over a year. Right? It's going to rain for 40 days and 40 nights. The water is going to be over the earth for 100-something days. And then eventually it's going to recede and recede and recede. And then eventually they're going to start sending out birds. And eventually they're going to finally be able to exit the ark. But this is the main thing that the author wants you to know. Look at chapter 7, starting in verse 21. And all flesh that moved on the earth breathed its last. That is birds and cattle and beasts and every swarming thing that swarms upon the earth, as well as all mankind. All in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life, of all that was on the dry land, died. Thus he blotted out every living thing that was upon the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to birds of the sky, and they were blotted out from the earth. And only Noah remained, and those that were with him on the ark. 3 different times in those 3 verses, the author goes out of his way to express in 3 different ways that everything died. Right? And then, in a 4th way, he goes on to specify only Noah and his family remained. Right? So that's 4 times in 3 verses that the author is communicating one truth. Everything died. Right? Every living thing. The reason I highlight that is because, once again, I don't want us to think this is supposed to be a happy story that you just like slap on the wall of a Sunday school room. The author of Genesis wants you to weep with God. Right? Whenever it said that God was grieved in his heart, you as the reader are supposed to be grieving with God. Right? Because God does not delight in this, and I can guarantee you Noah did not delight in this. Noah was in his 500s whenever the rain began to fall. Think about how many people that you have grown to know and love over the course of just a few decades alive. Imagine you were 500 years old, right? Imagine, that's 500 years that you could get to know people. You can make friends. Think about how big his family probably was. Imagine you are in the boat and you hear people banging on the outside, begging to come in. And you know you can't let them in, right? This is not supposed to be a happy moment. This is a sad and really traumatic moment, right? And that's what the author is trying to highlight, right? This is not oh yay, let's just hop to the rainbow at the end. No. We're supposed to sit in it. We're supposed to feel the pain. We're supposed to realize that man has become so evil that the creator of the universe had no choice but to wipe them out. And this sends a clear message about man, and it sends a clear message about God. It shows that God is, first off, slow to anger, but it shows that man is quick to sin. And it shows that man is so quick to sin and so thorough in his investigation of sin that eventually God will have to act. Right? And this really does set up the rest of the story of Scripture as well. Because as we're going to see after they get off the ark, the problem of sin is not resolved. Right? And so once they get out of the ark, this is just going to begin again. And so it really becomes like a ticking time bomb to where you're waiting for God to step in and judge the earth again.
Yeah.
Which is going to explain why God has to make a covenant with Noah once they get off the ark. Right? And so we read chapters 6, 7, and 8, and that is primarily the story of the flood. Right, you get to chapter 8, that's where you get to see all the stuff as the water's receding. And then you get to chapter 9, and that leads to the thing that we call the Noahic covenant. Right? This is what it says at the beginning of... let's actually start with the end of chapter 8, starting in verse 20. They just got off the ark. Then Noah built an altar to Yahweh, and took of every clean animal and every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And Yahweh smelled the soothing aroma. And Yahweh said to himself, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. And I will never again strike down every living thing as I have done. While all the days of the earth remain, seedtime and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. So, what is the very first thing that Noah does once he gets off the ark?
Offers a
Sacrifices
to God.
sin.
He offers a sacrifice. I think it's very interesting that we see this, right? Notice that as far we don't know what all God had revealed to Adam and Eve and Noah and them all at that time period, right? But the very first thing we see after the fall of man in the Garden of Eden is that God clothed them with skins, right? So there was a sacrifice involved there, right? You go to chapter 4 of Genesis, and what are Cain and Abel doing? Offering sacrifices, right? Here, after all this destruction has happened, the first thing Noah does when he gets off the ark is offer a sacrifice, right? And so the theme of sacrifice is going throughout the whole story as well, right? And as soon as Noah gets off of the ark, what he does is he dedicates the world to God, right? He creates an altar and he worships. And as a result of this, God makes a promise to Noah. And if you were to keep reading this, we're not going to break down every single verse, but what God does is he institutes a covenant with Noah. A covenant is basically a very, 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 very strong promise. And it's a promise between two different people, right? In this instance, what we see here is we see an unconditional covenant, right? There's going to be all sorts of different covenants that we deal with in the Bible. Some of them are unconditional, some of them are conditional. What we mean by unconditional covenants is that it's between two people, but usually it's on God's end unconditional in the sense of no matter what man does, God's going to hold his end of the deal, right? There are also going to be some covenants that are conditional, which means that what God does is going to be in response to what man does, right? And so it's a two-way street in that regard. This is an unconditional covenant. The people that God makes the covenant with, we read this in verses 9 and 10 of chapter 9, is with Noah and his seed, with every living creature, and with all future generations. So who is he making it with?
Noah and his family.
Okay, Noah and his seed. So that would be those 8 people, right? Okay, and then every living creature, what does that account for?
Every creature that was on the ark?
Yeah, right? Because everything else is wiped out, right? So those 8 people and every animal, but then also all future generations, what does that account for?
Every generation after Noah.
Everybody else, right? So all the future generations of Noah and his family and all the future generations of the animals, right? So this, basically, this covenant that God makes is with all living things, right? Like we would be included in this covenant, right? Because we are descended from Noah and his family, right? And so it's with Noah and his seed, every living creature, all future generations. This is to everybody. It's interesting. God makes a covenant to animals, right? But it's because the covenant is between God and really life. Life itself is the thing that this covenant hinges around, right? What he promises is, first off, to never again destroy all life with a flood. And then secondly, to never again destroy the earth with a flood, right? So notice those are two separate things, right? Sometimes a lot of times we focus on the second one, but really it's both, right? So he's not going to wipe out all life with a flood in the sense of human beings and animals, they're not going to be killed by a flood, right? And then secondly, the earth itself, because what seems to be implied by the Noah story is that through this flood, God almost kind of recreated the earth, right? Because remember what Noah's father promised? He promised that this man would bring rest to the earth that God had cursed. So during the flood, it was basically God bringing rest to the earth, right? So he's kind of recreating it in a sense, and he's anointing it for a new creation. And so in many ways, Noah is like a second Adam being born into a second paradise, right? And so God promises to never again destroy all life, never again destroy the earth, and the sign that he gives to mark this covenant is the hanging of his bow in the clouds. And the word in Hebrew there is literally just bow, right? We rightly interpret it as rainbow, but it's actually the language of an archer's weapon, right? Like an archer's bow. What God is saying is that prior to this moment, his bow of judgment and his arrows were pointing towards the earth, right? He had the string pulled back, and through the flood, he fired those darts down to the earth. But he says his judgment is over, and so he metaphorically hangs the bow in the clouds, right? So whenever you see the rainbow, it's metaphorically God's like bow and arrow hanging on the wall, saying that I'm not touching it. I am not looking down on you in judgment right now. He does not say that he's never again going to destroy all life. He does not say he's never again going to destroy the earth. He simply says with a flood, right? Because once again, this was simply a foretaste of the future redemption and restoration that's going to come. And so there is still going to be this future day of wrath, and pretty consistently going forward in the Bible, it's described as a day of fire, right? And so the earth was cleansed by water once, and then in that future day, it will be cleansed with fire, right? And that will be really the culmination of all things. And so one thing that I want you to notice here is what the rainbow really means. Because once again, I want you to picture this from Noah's perspective, right? Think about what Noah just went through, right? He literally just lost everybody, right? Once again, 500 years alive. Think about how many people you would know, right? Think about how many friends you would make, right? And now here you are, getting off this boat that you've been on for a year with just 7 other people. And you're walking into this new creation, and you probably know that y'all are going, you're a new Adam, but things are still going to continue being a problem, right? And sin is still going to abound. And you're probably wondering, when we repopulate this earth, am I just sentencing my future family to death? Right? Because it's like from Noah's perspective, that's probably got to be a traumatic event.
Yeah.
Right? I'm hoping that during this whole flood thing, God washed away all the corpses and stuff and that they disintegrated in the water or something like that. I don't know. Right? But you've got to know that this is like, we like to just make it like all like cutesy Sunday school type story. This was terrifying. Right? He went in the boat and there was all these other humans living. He comes out of the boat and it's just them. Right? That is a terrifying experience. And going forward, God recognizes that. And so he graciously makes this promise to reassure them, I'm not going to do this all the time. Right? Like he's reassuring them, this wasn't me just getting frustrated and feeling like I needed to do it. He said, I sent a message, and now that the message has been sent, the message has been made clear. Right? I will not tolerate sin. Right? So it's not like whenever things get this bad again, it's not like God's just going to send another flood. He says, no. This one flood was enough, right? My message has been communicated with this flood. I'm not going to do this again. I'm not going to recreate things. Whenever I come for the future day of judgment, that will be the end, right? And so this is really, this covenant is supposed to kind of reassure Noah and his family, right? It's to give them confidence that God is not this angry dictator in the sky who's just going to, at any moment, smite people down. That's not what this is. He says, no, this was a one-time thing. I've sent my message. You get it now. And now go, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. Right? And so he gives Noah and his family the same command that he once gave to Adam and Eve. Which then leads us to this next story, which once again is one of the weirdest stories in the entire Bible. This is what we read. If you go down a little bit further into into Genesis chapter 9, let's look at verse 18. Now the sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem and Ham and Japheth. And Ham was the father of Canaan. These were the three sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was scattered abroad. Then Noah began to be a man of the land and planted a vineyard. And he drank of the wine and became drunk and uncovered himself inside his tent. Then Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took the garment and laid it upon both of their shoulders and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were turned backward so that they did not see their father's nakedness. Okay, so once again, weird story. People will debate about what exactly is going on here. The main thing that people typically highlight is the issue of nakedness, right? And usually people debate about what exactly is going on in the story, right? One prevailing theory is that whenever it says uncovered his father's nakedness, it's not referring to him actually seeing Noah naked. It's actually referring to Ham. It's referring to Ham sleeping with his own mother. And this is because if you go to the book of Leviticus, it will say that whenever if you sleep with your mother, you are uncovering your father's nakedness. It uses the same language, right? That is a potential theory. I don't necessarily land there, though. And once again, you can land wherever because there's legitimate arguments for all these. But I noticed that with Shem and Japheth, the whole thing that they're doing is that they are walking backwards to cover the Noah with the blanket. Which seems to me that the actual issue is Noah's nakedness, right? Either way, though, I think that you can have both interpretations and still realize the main thing that the author is trying to highlight here, right? Nakedness is still associated with shame, right? Why is that significant?
And you mean in terms of like the overarching story that's being
told?
told?
Yeah, because I'm trying to teach you to think of these stories as one interconnected thing. Because a lot of the times we view Genesis as a bunch of interconnected, disconnected stories, but it's all one story, right? Genesis chapters 1 through 50 is one contained story. What does nakedness having to do with shame? How does that advance the story we've read so far?
I think it's probably communicating to the author that sin is still prevalent because we just saw that basically all of the population was wiped out and all the animals and everything. So then your next question would be, okay, so is sin gone? Did God wipe out sin?
Yeah.
And so Noah offers a sacrifice, and this is the first situation where you see people, I guess, interacting with people, and so you're seeing that sin is still in the world. So just because God wiped out the earth doesn't mean that he wiped out sin also. It's still prevalent.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right, right?
So I guess the promise, I guess then it means that
There remains of it are still there.
yeah, so it means that like the curse that we saw whenever God was talking to the serpent and to the woman and to the man, that hasn't been resolved yet. Like that's still there.
Yeah, because that's the lingering issue, right? Because remember, ever since God made that promise about the seed coming to crush the serpent, what are we supposed to be doing?
Awaiting
Point out.
that.
We're supposed to be waiting for that servant to arrive up, right? We're supposed to be crying out, "Come, Lord, come, Lord, come, Lord." Right? Eve has Cain, and what does she call him? The gotten one, right? She's hoping that maybe this one could be the chosen one. And then it seems like that was what Noah's father was hoping as well, right? This one will bring us rest, right? That's what Noah's father was hoping. And so here, or that's what it seems, right? We don't know for sure, but that's what it seems like, right? He is placing his hopes into this one man. And then now, here we have Noah, who is the first person to act in obedience. He comes off the ark, the new Adam, who the first thing he does is dedicate the new creation to God. Everything's looking really, really good. And you're supposed to be wondering,
Oh yeah.
could this guy have just resolved the story? Because and think about what God just said. I'm never going to wipe out the earth again.
Right.
You're thinking, oh my gosh, maybe the problem's been solved.
Right.
But then you have Noah being found naked. Well, you go back to the Garden of Eden, right? And the first thing you learned about them, the thing that summarized paradise was they were naked and unashamed. Right? That is literally, like, that's the only phrase. Notice that there's nothing else that we really learn about paradise. Right? It says that Adam and Eve were created, right? And then it says that man and woman unite to one another and they're made one flesh. And then we're given one sentence to summarize all of their time in paradise. Now the man and his wife were both naked and they were not ashamed. That's it. Right? Their entire experience in paradise, we don't know how long they were there. The one thing we know about it was that they were naked and unashamed. And the very first thing that happens after they eat the forbidden fruit is that they realize they're naked. Okay, well now here Noah is, the new Adam, in a new paradise. And what happens? He eats the forbidden fruit, right? It's not forbidden fruit, but he gets drunk, right? He has too much alcohol. He's laying down drunk. And lo and behold, somebody sees him naked. And everybody recognizes that there's something shameful with this, which is basically the author telling us that Noah and his family recognize that they are not the Messiah and his... No, they are simply a foretaste, right? There is still shame associated with nakedness. The story has not been resolved yet, right? That's what's being communicated through that. And so what happens here is that Noah catches wind of what Ham has done. And so, verse 24, we read this. Then Noah awoke from his wine, and he knew what his youngest son had done to him. And so he's going to turn to Ham, and he's going to lay out this curse. But I want you to notice that he doesn't actually curse Ham, he curses Canaan. So he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants, he shall be to his brothers. And he said, Blessed be Yahweh, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. And Noah lived 350 years after the flood, so all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died." Okay, so this is interesting. Noah lays out this curse. Once again, it's almost like a repeat of the Garden of Eden, right? To where God showed up and he started cursing things. Well, Noah also shows up and he starts cursing and blessing things. The first thing he curses is Canaan, which is weird, because who is Canaan?
He's the seed of Ham.
He's the son of Ham.
Son.
Well, now you might ask, well, why is it exactly that he curses the son of Ham rather than Ham himself? That is kind of weird, right? And this leads some people to, once again, mention the fact, or mention the theory that maybe Ham did sleep with his mom, and then maybe Canaan was the product of an incestuous relationship. That is possible. I'm going to present a different theory, right? And what I want you to notice is exactly the structure of what he communicates. So first off, he says, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brothers." So if you're creating a hierarchy here, right, where does Canaan fit on the hierarchy of his brothers? He's on the bottom, right? A servant of servants shall he be to his brothers, right? So both of his brothers, Canaan's on the bottom, right? Ham is on the bottom, all right? So his seed, Canaan, is cursed to be a servant of his two brothers, all right? And he said, "Blessed be Yahweh, the God of Shem," all right? "And let Canaan be his servant." All right, so Canaan is the servant of Shem. "May God enlarge Japheth." The word for enlarge in Japheth is actually a pun there. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servants. All right, so may he enlarge Japheth, and where's Japheth going to dwell? In the tents of Shem, right? So this would place Japheth in between Ham and Shem, right? So Shem's on top. Blessed be the God of Shem, right? And the main thing I want to highlight here might possibly, this is just something that I noticed. I've never really seen anybody else highlight this, but this is something that I've noticed in my own study of this. Noah's words to Ham and Japheth are about their seed. His words to Shem are about his God, right? Notice he says, cursed be Canaan. He does not say cursed be Ham. So he's talking about the seed of Ham, right? Cursed be Canaan, servant of servants. When he talks about Japheth, he says, may God enlarge Japheth. Well, he's obviously not just talking about Japheth himself, because he's not asking for Japheth to be fat, right? He's talking about Japheth's family, and he wants it to be enlarged. So in regards to both Ham and to Japheth, Noah is specifically talking about their seed, right? But he doesn't mention the seed of Shem, does he? Instead, who does he talk about in regards to Shem? He said, blessed be
the God, Yahweh, the God of Shem.
Blessed be Yahweh, the God of Shem. That's interesting. But if you think about it, do you know who Jesus is going to be descended from? So which one is the blessed seed in this regard? Who's on top? Shem, right? Jesus is going to be descended from Shem. And so, if you actually think about it, in each of these occurrences, Noah is actually talking about the seed of them, right? The seed of Ham is Canaan. The seed of Japheth is the one that Noah's praying to be enlarged here. And it just so happens that the God of Shem also will be his seed. Because eventually the Messiah is going to show up and he's going to be born of Shem, right? And it's just going to happen. It's going to be that the Messiah happens to be God in the flesh, right? And so in each of these occurrences, Noah is actually speaking of the seed of the son that he's referring to. I just think that's interesting, right? I've never really seen that explanation given because really it is hard to explain. Like, that's the only explanation that I've been able to come up with that actually makes sense of the whole thing. Because otherwise you have to figure out why he addresses Shem and Japheth, but then with Ham, who is actually the guilty party, why he references Canaan instead, right? Whereas to me, if you actually look at it, each of them are in reference to the seed. Another reason you could say that he addresses Canaan is because who was the original audience of the Torah?
Israel?
The Israelites, right? Specifically the Israelites who were dwelling where?
In the wilderness?
Well, they were in the wilderness, and what were they getting ready to do?
Enter the promised land.
Which was inhabited by?
Canaanites.
The Canaanites, right? And so it could be that this is one of those things where, like Moses, the author, he, instead of saying Ham, he says Canaan just for a rhetorical purpose to communicate something to the Israelites, right? He could simply be saying, hey guys, cursed be Canaan, right? Canaan, the people we're about to destroy, they're the ones that Noah cursed, so it's okay to go in there and wipe them out, right? It could be that that's also what's going on here, right? And so there's different theories you could go with, but this was just something in my own personal study that I noticed. I was like, well, technically, he's not wrong. Like, when he says, blessed be Yahweh, the God of Shem, technically Yahweh, the God of Shem, will also be descended from Shem because Yahweh, the God of Shem, is going to become incarnate through Shem's line, which is kind of cool. And so, whenever you actually go into chapter 10, what you see, and you can just understand the heading right here, Genesis chapter 10, it's basically what we call the table of nations, right? The generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And this might not sound as significant to us because we read it and we just get bored by everything it says. But you've got to realize that to the original audience, the people of Israel, this is letting you know how you relate to everybody, right? Because basically anybody who's descended from Ham, they're the villains, right? Those are the people you do not like.
Okay.
The people who are descended from Japheth, well, they might be bad guys, but, you know, you're more likely to be kind to them, right? Because people descended from Ham, they're the cursed line, right? And so if you actually look at the descendants of Ham here, you'll notice that a lot of those guys come back later in the Bible as bad guys, right? Whereas the ones who are descended from Japheth, they're not typically as bad, right? Some of them might be bad, some of them might be good, but then the ones descended from Shem, those are usually the ones that we're more inclined to favor. One person I want to highlight here is a guy named Eber, right? If you go to chapter 10, verse 25, this is what we read. Now 2 sons were born to Eber. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. What do you think it means whenever it says, in his days the earth was divided?
Like the civilizations went scattered abroad.
They went scattered abroad. What story is that speaking of?
Tower of Babel.
The Tower of Babel.
Boy.
Very good, which is where we're heading in Genesis chapter 11. Right? One thing I want to highlight here before we get into the Genesis 11 story is that it says that the land was divided during the days of Peleg, the son of Eber. Right? The reason this is significant is because Eber is actually where we get the name that Israelites are oftentimes known as. They're known as the Hebrews. Right? Well, that comes from Eber. Right? Eber, there's different theories for where Hebrews comes from, but this is the prevailing theory. It comes from Eber, and that makes sense. Right? Because it seems like Eber was the father of the Hebrew people whenever the land was divided into different things. Right? And so that's ultimately where it comes from. Right? That being said, let's look at Genesis chapter 11, where we read this account. Now the whole earth had the same language and the same words. And it happened as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. Then they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone, and they had tar for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city, and a tower whose top will reach into heaven. And let us make for ourselves a name, lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth." Then Yahweh came down to see the city, and the tower which the sons of men had built. And Yahweh said, "Behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they have begun to do. So now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, so that they will not understand one another's language." So Yahweh scattered them from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there Yahweh confused the language of the whole earth, and from there Yahweh scattered them over the face of the whole earth. The word Babel or Babel means confusion. Later on, the Bible will actually translate the word Babel differently, but in Hebrew it's the same word. Later on, this same word will be found rendered Babylon. Right? Babylon and Babel, same place. Right? So this is the birth of Babylon, which is also going to be significant later on in the story as well. Right? So the Tower of Babel story, I think, can best be described as yet another fall story. Right? A lot of the times we view Genesis 3 as the fall, but I've tried to highlight how really Genesis chapters 1 through 11 are just a bunch of fall stories. Right? So Genesis chapter 3, that's the first fall. Genesis chapter 4 with Cain and Abel, a second fall. And Genesis chapter 11 here is a third fall. Right? So you have God giving this rule to Adam and Eve. They break it. God confronts them, and they're punished. Right? Genesis chapter 4. Cain is frustrated over how God responded to Abel's sacrifice. God confronts him. Cain is punished. Genesis chapter 11, man starts doing something he's not supposed to do. God confronts them. Man is punished. Right? And so really, these are three consecutive fall stories. And Genesis chapter 11 kind of ends the big first section of Genesis. Because from Genesis 12 going forward, we're no longer going to be dealing with the entire earth. We're going to be dealing with one nation. But this chapter is the one that bridges the gap, that explains why we're only going to be dealing with one nation. Right? So, what exactly happens here? I already just read the whole thing, but somebody recap the story for me.
How I always interpret it was that they basically just wanted to be like, make a name for themselves, and what they mean is basically just like, either escape Earth and not have to like deal with the sin there, or basically just be able to go come to like heaven and like kind of cheat your way there, and just like basically because they want to be like great. It's like the same thing with the devil, and the reason why he became the devil is because he wanted to become better than God. So
Yeah.
So it could be either one of those two.
Yes.
But,
So I don't think that their goal is to actually reach heaven itself.
Okay.
But I think you're right about the first part. It's about making a name for themselves, right? That's the main issue, right? They want to be like God, right? I don't think that they actually think, like, it's not like they think that if they build high enough, they're going to sneak into the actual domain of God. Even though there is a thing in the ancient Near East where, like, they associate mountaintops with the presence of God, right? So the higher you go, but that just makes sense, right? Because we associate heaven as being above, and so from the ancient Near East perspective, the higher you go, the closer you get to God. And the Bible's going to even go along with this, right? We actually don't read about this in Genesis, but if you go to like Ezekiel and stuff, we learn that the Garden of Eden itself was set on a mountain, right? And Moses is going to go up on a mountain to receive things from God, right? And so that is what they're doing, but really, they're doing the same thing that Adam and Eve were wanting to do, right? Remember, Eve, she was given this promise that she would become like God. Well, that's what these people are doing as well. Were you want to say something, Rocky?
Yes. Well, another thing they didn't do, or were supposed to do, is multiply the earth and all around the earth.
Yes.
Instead, they stayed in one place and built out. They were supposed to
Yeah, because if you think about it,
multiply and spread out.
yeah, and that really goes back to what I'm saying about the fall, right? Because if you think about it, back in the Garden of Eden, God gave them 2 commands, right? First off, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and then secondly, don't eat from this tree. Well, they broke the first. They broke the second one, right? Don't eat from the tree. Well, now at the Tower of Babel, remember Noah was told the same thing: be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. Here at the Tower of Babel, we see that that's not what they're doing. And so, what was the issue with the tower? Firstly, they were fueled by pride. They wanted to exalt themselves as God, making a name for themselves. Right? We see that in chapter 11, verse 4. And also in the same verse, we see that they were fueled by rebellion. They wanted to ignore God's authority, disobeying what he commanded them to do. Like Rocky just pointed out, God told them to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. But what they did instead is they decided that they wanted to basically create an empire. Right? Rather than filling the earth, they wanted to make a name for themselves and build higher, so that basically they were trying to build a structure that would draw everybody to them.
Okay.
Right? That's what their whole goal is, right?
It's like more of like a country, like nation, governmental thing.
That's exactly what they're doing, right?
Okay, I see.
They're trying to make... They're establishing government. That is what they're kind of doing here. They're trying to make it to where it's less about submitting to God's command and more about establishing themselves as the commanders. Right? If we build this tower, it will attract the eyes of everybody, and everybody will want to live here. Right? Everybody will move here, and we will establish an empire. And sure enough, whenever you read like the first century historian Josephus, right, he talks about this story, and he goes into even more depth about this, and that's exactly how he describes it as well. Right? This is a person acting in rebellion to God, right, and setting up this whole empire, trying to really just usurp God's authority. Right? Well, one thing... Sorry, what were you saying?
It's almost like they're wanting to be set apart, but like not in a holy way. Like they're wanting to be set apart to like draw other people to them, like making an empire, but they're not wanting to be set apart in a way that's like drawing people to God.
Well, they're setting themselves apart for their own glory, not for God's.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what's happening here, right? They're original legalists. No. So what we see here, I want you to notice that the same thing happens here that happened in the Garden of Eden, right? Lust the eyes, pride of life, lust the flesh, right? Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven. They wanted to be seen, right? Let's build this huge tower so everybody will see us. If you remember, Eve looked and she saw that the fruit was good for food, right? Her eyes were tempted. They also said, let us make for ourselves a name, right? They wanted to be praised. Well, that's pride of life. Just like Eve saw the fruit was desirable to make one wise. She thought she could get something out of it. And then it says, lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth. They wanted to be in charge, right? Lust the flesh, right? They wanted the authority. They wanted to be the ones in charge, not God. In the same way that Eve looked at the fruit and saw that it looked good to eat, right? So we see, once again, all of these things. And I told you this is going to be happening a lot throughout the Bible. You're going to see lust the flesh, lust the eyes, pride of life. At almost any moment where the Bible takes time to explain somebody's logic behind sinning, you'll find almost all 3 of these here. I'm not really going to highlight it every time we come across it, but I just want to highlight it here so that you start looking for it the more you go through it. Right? And so they're fueled by all these things, and then I want you to notice how God responds. Then Yahweh came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. What's funny about that?
Tower's like up, right? It's
Yeah.
Like, that's like rising.
Yeah.
So it's like he's greater than the tower anyway.
Exactly, right? The whole idea is that they're saying, that they're basically using language implying they want to be like God, right? Let us make a tower to the heavens, right? We can work our way up there. And then even after they've been building this whole thing, God has to come down to look at it. It's almost like God needs binoculars, right? Like the text is trying to emphasize how distant we have become from God, Right? Before, God did dwell with us in the Garden of Eden. Right? But now, we are so separated that no matter how high man climbs, God still has to come down. And it also just serves to highlight how much greater God is. Right? He's greater than us, right? We might like to think that we can become like gods. No, we can't. Right? We might be able to almost esteem to the level of like a Greek god. But that's because those guys are not actually powerful. Right? Those guys, like, there's a reason why the Greek gods, like why the Greeks believed in gods like that, is because those were the ones that were actually conceivable. Right? The God of the Bible is one who is way beyond any of that. And so no matter how high they build, God has to come down and look. And then the language that he uses there is very similar to the Garden of Eden. Right? Remember, if you go back to Genesis chapter 3, real quick, let me just flip there. Y'all don't have to flip there, but I'll read it for you. Genesis 3, Then Yahweh God said, Behold, the man has become like one of us to know good and evil. And now, lest he send forth his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever, therefore Yahweh God sent them out from the Garden of Eden. All right, well, you go here, he says, Behold, they are one people, and they have the same language. And this is what they have begun to do. So now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. So once again, just like in the Garden of Eden, it's like Icarus flying too close to the sun. Do y'all know that reference? It's a mythology reference. The idea is that their pride has overcome them, and they've tried to get too close to being like God. Right? In the Garden of Eden, it was because they tried to grasp the knowledge that was not theirs. Right? And God said, no, you can't be like me in that way. Well, in the same way here, they're trying to possess an authority that is not theirs. And so God said, no, you can't be like me in that way. And so just like he cast them out of the Garden of Eden, so now he's going to disperse them. Right? And so what we see in the Tower of Babel story is we get to see where all those nations came from that we read about in the previous chapter, in Genesis chapter 10. But now there is an issue. Right? If you go back to Genesis chapter 1, whenever God created man, what did we read about man?
That they were made in the image of God.
They were made in the image of God. Yep. They were made to reflect God. They were created to be a reflection of him and to be his image bearers. That's why man was created. And as we've been going through this story, that's another thing we haven't really emphasized, but that really is the goal that God's trying to accomplish with all this, right? He is trying to help establish his image once again, right? Because man keeps rebelling, right? Where God tells them to do one thing, they do the opposite thing. And so slowly but surely, that image of God is being fractured, right? Because if the image of God involves us reflecting God, well, every time we choose sin, we are reflecting God less and less, right? And you've got this promise in Genesis chapter 3 of the seed to come from the serpent, the seed to come from the woman to crush the serpent. Well, that person is going to be the image bearer of God, right? The only way he can crush the serpent is if he doesn't bow to the serpent, right? The only way that he can crush the serpent is by choosing to image God and not submit to the serpent's ways, right? And so in the future, there's going to be this one person who comes who is going to actually be able to overcome things. But along the way, God is wanting to send a message to the world to bring people back to him, right? And so the whole question is, how are we going to have this seed of the woman that arises, right? And so in Genesis chapter 3, we saw the fall. Genesis 4, we had Cain and Abel. And we saw that Cain chose to go to what seed did he choose to identify with?
The serpent.
The serpent, right? And then they had Seth, remember? And they said Seth has appointed, like God gave us Seth to replace Abel, right? And so Seth was from the seed of the woman. And then Genesis 5 was this genealogy that traced the genealogy, like the seed of the woman, from Seth all the way to Noah. Well, when you go to the end of Genesis 11 now, you've got another genealogy, right? And it traces Noah all the way until you get to a guy named Abraham. The main thing I'm highlighting this for is because what God's doing is he is preserving his image through the seed of the woman, right? And once again, all creatures are created, all humans are created in the image of God. But once again, that image has been fractured. And so what God is wanting to do is he's wanting to bring all peoples back to himself. That's the goal, right? My 7-word summary of the Bible. God's commitment to dwelling with man again, right? God is committed to doing that. And he is going to redeem and restore all creation. But in order to do that, he needs people to come back to him, or else there's never going to be anybody to actually live in that redeemed and restored creation. Right? As we're going to see, repentance is going to be necessary for humans, and they're going to need to be coming to him in order to be actually part of his kingdom. So what God needs to do is he needs to send a message to the world. Right? Noah was that message, but the thing is, the rest of the world died. Right? And so as time passes, here we get to the Tower of Babel, and now all of a sudden the world is dispersed and spread out, and the question is, okay, well, now not everybody's listening to God, right? The reason why God had to disperse them is because they were not listening to him. Right? That's the exact reason why he had to disperse them. Because the only thing they were united in was in their rebellion. And so the question facing God now, and the question really at the hinging point of the story here, is how is God going to bring the world back to himself if everybody is disconnected from one another and living in separate places, and the only thing you're united in is in the rebellion against God? Right? It's one thing to bring people back to yourself if they're all one people speaking one language. But now you don't have one people speaking one language. Right? Now you have a bunch of people speaking different languages spread over the face of the earth. So how is it that you, as a holy God, can bring people back to yourself? What do you think God's solution is going to be?
A special people group.
Maybe he needs to pick one of those nations to serve as an example for everybody else. That leads us into Genesis chapter 12.
Abraham.
Right? And that's what I'm trying to say, because a lot of times people treat Genesis 1 through 11 as a separate story from 12 through 50. It's not a separate story. Right? The way that Genesis 11 ends is with a question mark, because now you've got to figure out how God is going to continue bringing about the redemption and restoration he promised now that everybody's divided. And so what God's going to do is he's not going to do things the same way he's been doing them. Instead, what he's going to do is he's going to find one guy, and from that one guy, he is going to create an entire nation, and that nation will serve the purpose of being a light to all the other nations. And that is where, in Genesis 12, we begin the story of the people of Israel. And this story is going to take us all the way to the end of Revelation. Right? And so, going forward, the Bible is the story of the people of Israel. Right? And that might sound weird to us as Christians, but you have to realize that we are playing a part in that story. And there's a reason behind that. Right? Because nobody in here is Jewish. Right? Wow. We're all Gentiles. Right? If the biblical worldview is that there's Jews and then Gentiles. We're all Gentiles. But we have to realize that the reason we're Gentiles is a result of the Jewish people. Right? Because it was what God, like the whole reason God is picking Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, as we're going to see, is in order to bless all the nations. And it's not going to take a really long time for us to figure that out. We're going to see that in the first few verses. Genesis chapter 12, this is what we read. And Yahweh said to Abram, go forth from your land, and from your kin, and from your father's house, to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. Right? So right there, in the opening verses where God speaks to Abram, he communicates his whole purpose. He says, hey, through you, Abram, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Not just Abram and his family. Abram and his family, he does communicate right before that. He says, y'all are going to be especially blessed. But all the nations are going to be blessed through you. Right? So even though the story of Genesis 12 through Revelation chapter 22, even though that is the story of the people of Israel, it serves the purpose of communicating something to all the nations. Right? And that's the whole purpose. Right? The way that the things are shaken up at the Tower of Babel changes things going forward. But what God's going to do, and we're going to read about this again in Deuteronomy chapter 32, is that whenever God disperses the nations, he is going to pick one nation, and he's going to, even though he's the God of creation, he is going to choose one nation to be his inheritance. Right? So the other nations will have their different gods. Right? The Canaanites will have their gods. The Egyptians will have their gods. But Yahweh, the God of creation, is going to choose Israel, and he's going to be the God of Israel. Right? And so that's what we read in Genesis chapter 12. And we're going to spend some time here because those first three verses right there are going to set up pretty much the rest of the Bible. So we really need to understand those if we're going to understand the rest of things. But first, let's go back at the end of Genesis 11 and just look at how that ended, right? So I mentioned that there's another genealogy, right? We read about another 10 generations, and then you read this in verse 27. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran became the father of Lot. And Haran died in the presence of Terah the father in the land of his birth, in Ur of the Chaldeans. Abram and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and the father of Iscah. And Sarai was barren, she had no children. Now why is it that you think the Bible would tell us that Sarai was barren and had no children?
Presumably maybe to foreshadow the chapter afterward.
Yeah, it's going to become relevant later on, right? That's usually something that we just need to try to notice whenever the Bible says something interesting. Like whenever there's a little detail that's just kind of out of place, it's probably because that's going to be important later on. It's kind of like when you're watching a movie and somebody walks by and then like the camera just like lingers on like a tattoo they have on their shoulder. You're like, I probably need to remember that for later on, right? Same thing here, right? Sarai's barren, she has no children. Something you need to remember. And Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai the daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to go to the land of Canaan, and they came as far as Haran and settled there, right? The main reason you need to know they make it to Haran is because that's going to come back later as well. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran, right? So here you got Abram, and one of his brothers dies, and then the remaining brother and the nephew, and everybody's moving with the dad over to Haran, and then Terah dies, and then you go straight to Genesis chapter 12, and this is where God talks to Abram. And this is the first thing I want you to notice. Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, God begins to speak to Abram, and immediately he starts making some pretty crazy demands. Go forth from your land, from your kin, and from your father's house, to the land which I will show you. Do you notice how that gets more specific? Right? Go from your land, right? That's the general vicinity. What does kin reference?
Family.
Family, right? So go from your land where you're living, go from your family, and go from your father's house, right? Well, that's extra specific, right? That's talking about the literal building you're living in, right? So it's zoning in, and if I were to paraphrase, I would say leave everything, right? Leave your land. Well, not just your land. Leave your entire family. And not just your family. Leave your very house. Right? Leave everything. And you notice where he tells them to go?
The land which I will show you.
The land which I will show you.
Yep.
Right? That is very vague. Right? I want you to notice that God is very specific in what he asks Abram to give up. But he's very vague on the directions where he is telling Abram to go. That is because right here in this verse, God is inviting Abram to live by faith. I also want you to remember this language here because it's going to come back later on when we get to Abram's final test in Genesis chapter 22. We're not going to reach that chapter today, I do not think, because that would be, we would have to be going crazy fast. But that's going to be coming back in. I'm sure we'll cover it next week. And so, unless somehow we end up getting there, but I don't think so. So he says, leave everything and go somewhere. But he gives Abram a bunch of promises that are going to help motivate him to go do it. He says, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. I will bless those who bless you. The one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So there's a bunch of things that God promises Abram. There's actually, 7 things that I number there? Right? The first thing he promises is to make him a great nation. All right? What does it mean to make somebody a great nation?
Somebody as in like the nation itself enlarging and becoming better.
Yeah, he's going to basically have such a big family that it becomes a great nation. What's the problem with that?
It's just him.
It's just him, and what do we know about what's the one thing we know about his wife?
She's barren.
Barren.
Oh.
That's interesting. This also begins to communicate something. I've tried to tell you this already, but the book of Genesis is not only introducing us to the story of the people of Israel, it's introducing us to God. Right? And so every time you see God show up and talk, you're learning something about him. Right? And the one thing we know about Abram is that he's an old dude. And the one thing we know about Sarai is that she can't have kids. And now God shows up, and the very first promise he makes to Abram is, I'm going to make you not just a nation, a great nation. Well, that implies you're going to be a pretty notable nation. Well, this tells us something about God. He likes finding people and putting them in impossible circumstances so that whenever those circumstances are taken out of the picture and God's promises come true, who gets the glory? God. It'd be one thing if God showed up to some young dude with a brand new wife and was like, hey, I'm going to make you a great nation. Okay, well, once that actually came to pass, you could argue that maybe it came from God. Maybe it came from just natural productivity, right? But you know who you, like, the one way to guarantee that something's a miracle? Well, if God shows up and you've got this old dude with a barren old wife who begin to have a family.
Basically,
Whenever that happens,
yeah.
whenever that happens, you're like, okay, this is a miracle, right? Because even to this day, there's an age range, and once a woman gets past that age range, she can't have kids, right? Sarai, she's well past that age range, and she wasn't even able to have kids when she was in the age range, right? But God says, I'm going to still give you a kid. So that whenever she has that one child, right? What I want to highlight is that Abram is not going to see this great nation. Right? For Abram, he is going to see one child from that great nation born. But that one child's existence is confirmation to him that the rest is true. Right? Because if God is going to produce this one child from this barren old woman, well, then he can produce a great nation from that child. Right? So the first thing he promises is he's going to make him a great nation. The second thing he promises is what?
To bless it.
To bless him. What does it mean to bless somebody?
Actually, somehow I don't know the definition of bless at all.
Good. I'm glad that you admitted that, because a lot of times people just make up definitions. To bless is actually a very difficult thing to define. Blessing is very difficult. One thing we can say is that it is the opposite of cursing.
Right.
Cursing seems to do, it has to do primarily with destruction, right? And so by contrast, it seems like blessing has primarily to do with life. Right.
Maybe healing.
I think the way that I would define blessing is it is God's promise to give you everything you need for life and faithfulness.
Okay, I see.
Right. That's really what it is. Right. It is not God necessarily saying He's going to make you rich, even though for Abram he will become rich. Right. But whenever God says that you'll be blessed, it's not Him saying that you're going to be like we define blessing in certain ways. Right. We immediately say, I just got a promotion at my job. That's a blessing from God. Well, it could be, unless you can't handle money well, unless you're greedy, in which case it seems like that promotion is actually a curse because it's going to lead you into sin, right? Yeah. Blessings, we like to define blessings in terms of material gain. That's not how God necessarily defines it, right? It can be that way, but He's more focused on giving you what you need to survive and giving you what you need to be faithful, right? That's primarily what God seems to have in mind when it comes to blessing. Right? Whereas cursing are the opposite, right? It is something that will lead to your destruction, both physically and spiritually, right? So He can deprive you of life itself, or He can begin to harden your heart. And He can begin to hand you over to your sin, right? And so those seem to be what blessing and cursing are, right? So He promises He's going to bless Abram no matter what, right? Notice that there's no condition here, right? Once again, we have another covenant being made, right? We had the covenant to Noah, and now we have a covenant to Abram. Right? And really, Genesis chapters 12, 15, and 17 are really going to outline this covenant. And that's what we're going to be focusing on really for the rest of tonight. And so He says, I'm going to bless you. Nextly, He says, I'm going to make your name great. What does it mean to have your name be great?
Well known.
Well known.
You'll be known.
Right? You're going to be popular. A few thousand years from now, 4,000 years from now, there's going to be a group of people sitting in Seabrook, Texas, talking about you. Whoa, it's wild, right? Think about it. This is some random dude, right? And notice that at least with Noah, we saw Noah found favor in the eyes of God, right? And we got to see Noah's obedience and stuff like that. Abram, we don't know anything about this guy so far, right? God just shows up and He says, hey, Abram, leave everything, go here. Here's what I'm going to do for you. God just starts making promises. I'm going to make your name great. I'm going to make you popular. I'm going to make you well known. I'm going to make people fear you. You will be a blessing. So not only is He going to give Abram the things he needs to live and be faithful, but Abram himself will be a blessing to others. Right? Something about Abram's very existence going forward will help equip other people for life and faithfulness. That's interesting. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who slight you. The translation I read a second ago said, I will curse those who curse you. In Hebrew, they're two different words, right? One is stronger than the other, right? It really says, I will curse those who slight you. So the idea is that for those who even slightly dishonor Abram, God will come on them with full force, right? This is really important, right? That's why I have these graphs over here to the right here.
Right.
Because what we're seeing, God is giving us a theology of Israel here, right? And this should inform even how we live today, right? So this is going to be very applicational for us. Let's look at the top one first. What do you see in common with all of the things on the top part of the graph there?
Blessings.
Blessings everywhere, right? You'll notice that the white parts are the things that are consistent in both graphs, right? No matter what, whether you're looking at the top graph or the bottom graph, Yahweh is blessing Abram, and Abram will bless others, right? That's at least what God has designed, right? God, like no matter what, Yahweh is going to bless Abram because God has promised to do it, right? So that's unconditional. God will do it. And no matter what, in some way, Abram will bless other people. There's going to be an extent to which Abram will choose to be a blessing, and sometimes he's not going to do so great. And whenever I say Abram, I'm not just talking about Abram, but I'm talking about his seed as well, right? But in some way, regardless of what Abram does, he will be a blessing to other people, right? The big question comes in regards to how other people relate to Abram and how Yahweh relates to other people, right? So if Abram is the father of the Israelites, then who would the other people be?
The other people that are not part of this family.
The people who aren't Israelites, which we would call them what?
Enemies or... No.
Gentiles, right? Gentiles,
Wow.
right? So really the three people you have here is Yahweh, Israel, Gentiles, right? I've got Abram here because technically there are going to be a few people descended from Abram who are not Israel, right? Because you're going to have Ishmael and stuff like that. But by and large, this is talking about Israel, right? So you got Yahweh, Israel, Gentiles, right? So the relationship between Yahweh and Israel is set. He's going to bless Israel. The relationship between between Israel and the Gentiles is set, right? The question is, how are the Gentiles going to respond to Israel? And God says that based off of how we, Gentiles, respond to Israel, that's going to determine how God responds to us. This is going to shape everything going forward in the Bible, right? So, if everything goes according to God's plan, the Gentiles will bless Abram, right? The others will bless Abram. And if they do that, what's God going to do to them? Bless them, right? So if the Gentiles support Israel, if the others support Abram, and they help him live life, and they help him be faithful to God, then God will be faithful to them and help them as well, right? However, if the other people, if the Gentiles, if they even slightly dishonor Abram, if they even slightly dishonor Israel, what's God going to do to them? Curse them, right? You get the impression that all of salvation hinges on something about God's relationship with Israel, right? And sure enough, I mean, the Messiah comes from Israel, right? Whenever we say that we worship God, we have to realize we are talking about worshiping the God of Israel. And this is one issue that we've seen in the church over many, many centuries, is that the church has really struggled in their relationship with Israel. And I think that's because a lot of times we don't study the Old Testament enough.
Right.
But this right here tells me that I've got to be a friend of Israel, right? I mean, like I'm not saying that eternity hinges on this, but God does care about how you relate to Israel because Israel is his chosen people, right? And he says, if you slightly dishonor Abram, I'm going to curse you, right? And so if you're looking down on Abram and Israel, like I think this affects things even to this day. Even though right now I would argue that Israel is under this like temporary hardening by God. We'll talk about that when we get to Deuteronomy. Even though I think that Israel is under this temporary hardening, we still are called to love them and take care of them and protect them, right? Because they still are God's chosen people, right? And sure enough, as you read through Genesis, you're going to see this stuff play out in time, right? You're going to see the people who bless Israel blessed by God. And the people who curse Israel be cursed by God, right? This is going to be how it plays out, right? And basically, it allows you to really predict every story, right? If somebody is dishonoring Israel, you know how their story is going to end, right? Whenever the Babylonians destroy Jerusalem, you know that Babylon is going to be destroyed, right? That's just how it's going to work, right? Whenever the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, okay, well, the Romans are probably going to have to be destroyed as well, right? And so I think that continues even to this day, right? But if you understand those graphs right there, you will understand almost every single thing that happens in the rest of the Bible, right? You'll understand why whenever David shows up at the battlefield and he hears Goliath taunting them, he'll say, who does this uncircumcised Philistine think he is, that he would oppose the armies of the living God, right? David's like, has he not read Genesis chapter 12? He says, no, dude, you're dishonoring Israel. If you dishonor Israel, God is going to curse you. And so that's why David says, I don't need any armor. Goliath already dug his own grave. David's like, just give me my sling, give me a stone, I'll go take care of this guy. He's dishonoring Israel. He's got to go. Right? And so if you understand this, you'll understand the rest of the story. And so God says he's going to do all that, which then leads to the last thing that God promises him. In you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Notice what he says. He doesn't say, you will be the blessing to all the families of the earth. What does he say?
You will
All
be.
families.
In you, they will be blessed. So it's looking forward to the future, and it's talking about something that is in Abram. Well, it seems to ultimately be pointing back to the seed, right? And once again, as you read through the story, you really can't miss this, right? Because in Genesis chapter 12, God promises to make Abram a nation. Do you know what chapter Isaac's going to be born?
You mean 1?
21. Very good, right? So that's 10 chapters, right? 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. That's when the first child is born. Do you know what Abram is crying out that entire time? Come, Lord. Come, Lord. Come. Like, literally, I mean, think about how much time, like, in Genesis 5, we covered 2,000 years in one chapter. And now here, we're about to start a 10-chapter journey waiting for one child to be born. And that was immediately after God promised, in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. Right? It's almost like the author is wanting you to yearn for the Savior. Right? There's something in Abram. Right? Abram's seed is going to somehow not only bless Abram, but all the families of the earth. And now we go into this long, prolonged story of waiting for him to just have one child. Right? One seed. Right? And you're yearning for him to come forth. Right? So this is going to set in motion everything. Which, let's go back to the text here and let's begin to talk more about it. Right? So God shows up there, and let's see how Abram responds. So Abram went forth as Yahweh had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions which had accumulated, and the persons which they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go forth to the land of Canaan. Thus they came to the land of Canaan. And Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem to the oak of Moreh. Now the Canaanite was then in the land. Then Yahweh appeared to Abram and said, to your seed I will give this land. So he built an altar there to Yahweh who had appeared to him. So Abram responds in obedience, right? He gets up, he packs up everything, and by faith he goes down and he goes to the city of Shechem, right? And he goes to this oak that he's going to come back to plenty of times. So he goes to Shechem, and here God shows up to him and he says, hey Abram, this is the place I'm going to give you. Right? You get the impression that up until then he was just kind of wandering around. And then finally when he gets here, he says, Abram, this is the place. This is the land that I was wanting to show you. Look look forward, backward, to your left, to your right. This is the land. And what's the first thing Abram does?
Walk by faith.
Well,
Wait,
verse 7.
Built an altar.
Built an altar. Who does that sound like? Noah, right? It's almost like Abram is a new Noah. Right? He might not be the new Adam in charge of the whole creation, but he is the new Adam in charge of a whole nation. Right? And so now we have Israel being like a picture of what the whole earth was supposed to be. Right? Like it's almost like the whole story of creation is beginning again, but here it's just focused on this one little land of Israel. Right? So Israel will be a light in the darkness. It is going to be set apart. And they are going to be what everybody was supposed to be, right? As God is holy, they are going to be called to be holy. And so there in Shechem is where where Abram makes his first altar. He dedicates it to God, and he begins his journey, right? Then he proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to Yahweh and called upon the name of Yahweh. And Abram journeyed on, continuing toward the Negev. Right? So what happens is that he goes from Shechem to Bethel, and he makes an altar at Bethel, and then he just keeps wandering around. Right? When you go into the back half of Genesis chapter 12, we read a really sad story. We get to see that Abram is not the perfect guy. And what he's going to basically do is there's going to be a famine in the land, and Abram is going to go down to Egypt, and he's going to be kind of scared of what the Egyptians are going to do to him. And so what he's going to do is he's going to turn to his wife and say, "Hey, honey, my darling, my love, my perfect one, my bride, I'm afraid that whenever we get down to Egypt, everybody's going to think that you're really attractive," which you are. It's amazing. But whenever we get down there, they're going to want to kill me because they're going to want to marry you. Do you think that you can lie to everybody and just tell them that you're my sister? There's some issues with this, right? First off, that's your wife. Don't do that. That's a messed up thing to do. But in addition to that, yes, sir.
God made a promise to him, and he's worried about a few people killing him.
Yeah, so God made a promise to him, and he's worried about that. But what also is an issue there? What did the whole promise hinge upon?
That the seed would come from his wife.
The seed would come from him, right? I will, like literally the first promise, I will make you a great nation. Last promise, in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. Okay, how do you become a great nation if you gave up your wife? That's a bit of a problem, right? This is a lot bigger. Like, there's so many issues with it. Like, even if this promise hadn't been made, it would be a bad thing to do. But here we see that Abram is kind of forsaking the promise for the sake of his own self-preservation, right? So it's a lapse in faith. But the cool thing is that God is going to be faithful, right? So right off the bat, I love that it's all in the same chapter, right? Because here we get to see that God is going to be faithful to his promises, right? Because we just got this story started, and Abram's already messing up. I mean, if I were God, I'd be like, all right, you know what? This guy, he started off strong. He really messed up. Let me just go start with somebody else. But that's not what he did. He said, I will make you a great nation. I will make your name great. I will bless you. Right? God's committed to this. He's not going to go back. And so he doesn't abandon Abram here. Instead, he reveals to Pharaoh and the officials that Abram lied. And basically, he makes it so that Sarai is given back to Abram and they go back on their way. Right? And so that's one thing that we're going to see is that God, he doesn't just abandon Abram. No. He's made a promise. He's going to fulfill it. And so, even though Abram really screwed up and really messed up, God is going to still bless him. Right? And as we're going to see, even here, I think we read about it, right? Maybe it's in the next story. Because Abram's going to do this again. But we're going to see that even whenever Abram messes up, sometimes he's going to still be given extra money and stuff like that. To where God is still blessing him and still helping him prosper, even in the midst of his failures. Because this is God being faithful. We go to Genesis chapter 13. And in Genesis chapter 13, it turns out that Abram and his nephew Lot have become so prosperous that they literally can't, like, it's almost like a gunslinger old Western movie where they're like, this land ain't big enough for the two of us, right? To where basically they're both prospering so much that their shepherds are getting into arguments over where the sheep can graze. And so, just to preserve family unity, basically Abram and Lot decide to split, to just go separate ways cordially, and Abram gives Lot a choice. He says, okay, do you want this land over here or do you want this land over here? And Lot looks at this one land and he's like, man, that is some luscious green land. I want that land. And it just so happens that this land is the land where Sodom and Gomorrah are found at, right? If you go there nowadays, this is right on the coast of what we call the Dead Sea or the Salt Sea. And it's in the middle of what we know as the Judean desert or the Negev, right? Apparently back then, it was very fertile land. Nowadays, it is the driest place on earth.
It's kind
right?
of like Egypt.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, like, literally the Dead Sea is so salty that you can float in it, right? It's really bad. Yes, sir.
I remember going there.
Yep.
It's in my brain right now.
Yep. But yeah, so it's very interesting whenever you contrast this, because you're like, wow, I wonder what happened to that fertile land to make it so desert-like. We're going to read that story in a few chapters, right? And so they split up, they go separate ways. And when you get to Genesis chapter 14, it turns out that things are not all good in the neighborhood. Because at the beginning of Genesis chapter 14, what happens is that a group of people, a group of kings from the north, they decide that it's time to go raiding and conquesting. Right? This is things people would do back in the day. They would have like certain time periods where all the kings would just go out and try to conquer places. I mean, it makes sense, right? There's times of peace, times of war. They would all get up and just go conquer things. And it happens that a bunch of these kings, they go down and they conquer Sodom and Gomorrah and they take everybody captive. Well, what's the issue with that? Who's living in Sodom and Gomorrah now? Who's living in Sodom?
Abram and...
Not Abram.
Oh, no?
Lot's descendants?
Well, it's Lot, right? Yeah.
Lot.
So Abram and Lot, they separated. Lot went down to Sodom. Abram went somewhere else. Well, Lot is living in Sodom. And now Lot and his family and everybody in Sodom, they just got kidnapped and they were taken captives.
Okay.
So when Abram hears about this, what do you think Abraham does?
Goes to defend him.
Oh,
To
yeah.
help him out.
Yeah, Abram's like, oh, this will not do. And what we see in Genesis 14 is something that most people often just don't even know about Abram, is that this dude is terrifying, right? Not only is he this very wealthy, like Bedouin, like nomad traveler dude, he's like a warlord, right? And he can do a whole lot with very little. But that's not just because of how powerful he is, it's because God is with him. What were you going to say?
He's pretty old too.
He is pretty old, right? He's in his 70s. But what he's going to do here is he's going to say, oh, I am not allowing anybody to mess with my buddy Lot. And so what Abram does is he gets together basically just a troop of people and they march forward and they go destroy those other people and they get all the people of Sodom back. Right? And it says from that point forward that the fear of Abram spread throughout the land. Right? Well, it makes sense. But remember what God promised? I'll make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. God is making Abram's name great, even though the other stuff hasn't exactly happened yet. Right? Abram still does not have a kid, but now everybody knows Abram is somebody to be feared. Right?
Yep.
He just goes, he marches up there, he gets Lot back, and they start marching back down. And then we read this very interesting account on their way back down. Right? So it tells us that Abram went and he got Lot and them. He went as far as the city of Dan, which is basically the northernmost boundary of Israel. Whenever Ben and I were in Israel, we actually went to the city of Dan and we got to see a gate that Abram probably went through. Really cool. And so they're going back down from the north and they're heading back down towards the south where Sodom and stuff is at, right? And as they're going down, they're passing through this area, which nowadays we would know as Jerusalem, right? Jerusalem is like in the middle of Israel. But back then it wasn't known as Jerusalem, it was known as Salem. And we read this at the very end of Genesis 14. Very, very interesting story. Then after he came back from striking down Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. Right, so Abram just finished this whole battle, and as he's going back down, the king of Sodom comes to meet him there. And then, while him and the king of Sodom are meeting, we read about this very interesting story. So the king's valley is most likely the Kidron Valley, or one of the other valleys that surrounds Jerusalem. And so apparently, they're just outside of Salem, and while they're there, the king of Salem hears about this. And we read this. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High. Then he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. Then he gave him a tenth of all. And then he just disappears off the map. It says, And the king of Sodom said to Abram, Give the people to me, but take the possessions for yourself. Then Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have raised my hand to Yahweh, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. I will not take a thread or a sandal shaft of anything that is yours, so that you would not say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing except what you have given me, and the share of the men with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them take their share. Well, this is really weird, right? So you've got Abram meeting with the king of Sodom in this thing known as the King's Valley. This guy named Melchizedek, king of Salem, shows up, gives Abram a blessing. Abram gives Melchizedek stuff. Melchizedek disappears off the scene, and then Abram just goes back into his conversation with the king of Sodom as if it were nothing. But this Melchizedek passage has puzzled so many different people, right? And I'm not even here to give you a bunch of answers. I'm just here to tell you it's really cool. The main thing you need to notice is that Melchizedek is a king, right? The word Melchizedek literally means king of righteousness, right? Melech Zadok, right? Melech is king, Zadok is righteousness. Melchizedek, it means king of righteousness. And he is the king of Salem, right? Which we would believe to be Jerusalem, right? The word Salem is shalom, peace, right? So he is the king of righteousness, reigning over the city of peace. And he brings bread and wine to Abram. And then it tells us that not only is he a king, but he's a priest. And not only is he a priest, but he's a priest of the God Most High, right? El Elyon, right? And we don't know who El Elyon is at this point, but as we begin to read through verses 19 and 20, we realize that El Elyon is a title for Yahweh, right? It says, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth." So El Elyon is the creator of the heavens and the earth. It seems like Melchizedek just called him by a different name, but they've got the same person in mind. Right? He might not have called him Yahweh, he called him El Elyon, but he's talking about the one who created the heavens and the earth. And Melchizedek recognizes that Abram has been blessed by the creator of the heavens and the earth. So he recognizes that Abram has a special relationship with God. And blessed be El Elyon, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. So Melchizedek here, he is a priest of Yahweh. We don't know if he knew the name Yahweh, we don't know any of that. But he was both a priest and a king. He shows up out of nowhere, he blesses Abram, and he recognizes that God is with Abram. And then Abram gives him a tenth of stuff, and then they leave. This is weird. Very strange account, right? The author of Hebrews will talk about Melchizedek. The Psalms will talk about Melchizedek. People have all sorts of weird theories about Melchizedek. Some people will even say that he is the pre-incarnate Christ. I don't think so.
I honestly think he might be an angel.
Some people might think that. I think he's just a dude. I think he is just a guy, mainly because it says that he's a king and a priest.
Okay.
Right? I think that this is a guy who's just a king and a priest, but he is in tune with what God is doing. And I think one of the main reasons he exists is to teach us once again about these diagrams right here.
Okay.
Right? This guy recognizes that Yahweh has blessed Abram, and he blesses Abram, and Abram blesses him. And therefore, God's going to bless Melchizedek too, right? Sure enough, eventually the place where God is going to choose for his name to dwell is over the very city where Melchizedek is reigning right now, right? Jerusalem, right? It's a very weird story, right? And Melchizedek is just somebody you need to be familiar with because he comes up later on in the Bible as well. But we don't know much more about him than that, and so some people will kind of overstate what we know. But it's very, very interesting. This then leads us into Genesis 15, where we're going to learn more about the covenant that God makes with Abram. And this is what we read. "After these things, the word of Yahweh came to Abram in a vision, saying, 'Do not fear, Abram. I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great.'" One thing I want to highlight there is that it says the word of Yahweh came to Abram in a vision. I just think that's weird. It says the word came in a vision. Because typically words are something you hear, but it says that Abram is seeing the word of Yahweh, which might imply that the word of Yahweh is not simply like the word of Yahweh in the sense of like his actual words. It might be the word of Yahweh is a person, right? So whenever like in the Gospel of John, when it says in the beginning was the word and the word was with God and the word was God, well, it could be implying that the word of Yahweh is just another name for the angel of the Lord, right? So the word of Yahweh comes to Abram in a vision and he says, "Do not fear, Abram." Why would Abram be afraid right now? Usually you don't have to tell somebody to not be afraid unless they actually would have reason to be afraid.
Right. Maybe he just got back from such a, battle, or, I don't know.
Well, you're on the right track.
I'm trying to connect the stories.
Well, up until this point, Abram was just a wandering nomad. But now, as a result of this whole thing with Lot and stuff, Abram's face is on the map. Right now, everybody knows who Abram is, and everybody knows Abram is a force to be reckoned with. Right? Abram just took out like 5 kings. Right? And now he's just coming back and just chilling. Well, he probably realized that he's popular now. Right? A lot of people know how powerful he is. A lot of people know how much money he has. They're going to want to come after him. And God says, "Do not fear. I am a shield to you." Right? I'll protect you. I'll keep you safe. Your reward shall be very great. Right? So he's once again re-emphasizing that Abram's going to receive a lot of stuff. But Abram's confused. He says, "O Lord Yahweh, what will you give me as I go on being childless? And the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus." He says, "God, you promised me a child, you promised me a nation, but I still have not had a kid. I still only have Eliezer of Damascus. It's one of his servants." He says, "That's my heir." Right? I've got nothing right now. And Abram said, "Since you have given no seed to me, behold, one born in my house is to be my heir." Then behold, the word of Yahweh came to him, saying, This one will not be your heir, but one who will come forth from your own body. He shall be your heir. And he brought him outside. Notice that it's the word of Yahweh brought him outside. Once again, it's emphasizing that it's the word of Yahweh is a person. And he brought him outside and said, Now look toward the heavens and number the stars if you are able to number them. And he said to him, So shall your seed be. Notice the word seed. Seed, seed, seed. It shows up a lot. Then he believed in Yahweh, and he counted it to him as righteousness. All right. This is the very first time we encounter the word righteousness. Very interestingly, the first time we actually encountered it was in the name Melchizedek, right? Melech Zadok, king of righteousness. But here's the first time we encounter the word righteous in the entire Bible. One thing that I like to highlight is I like to highlight the first time a word shows up, right? Not only is this the first time we see the word righteous show up in the Bible, this is also the first time we see the word believe show up in the Bible. And it just so happens that believing is what leads to righteousness. But what I want you to notice is exactly what Abram is believing in, right? So in verse 1, Yahweh reaffirms his promise, right? God says, don't fear, I'll be your shield, your reward will be great, right? Reaffirms the promise. Verses 2 and 3, Abram voices his concern. He says, God, I don't have a child. Who will be my seed? Verse 4, Yahweh confirms that Abram's heir will come from his own body. And then, verse 5, he promises that his seed will be as numerous as the stars. Verse 6 is where it says, he believed in Yahweh, he counted it to him as righteousness. So what exactly was it that made Abram righteous in the eyes of God? Abram believed that the blessed seed would come from his own loins. You know what Abram's actually believing in? Jesus. He's believing in Jesus, right? He didn't know the name Jesus, but what he's believing in is that the future blessed seed who will bless all the families of the earth, the one who will crush the serpent, is going to come from his body. He did not know the name Jesus. He didn't know he'd be God in the flesh, but Abram's faith was in Jesus without knowing the actual theology behind it, right? And so, from beginning of the Bible to the end, righteousness comes from faith in Jesus, right? Abram was not saved by his actions. He was saved by his faith in Jesus, right? That's really cool. But that's not where the story ends. You keep reading, and what God's going to do is God is going to make his covenant with Abram official, right? And so if you read down there, what we see is that God tells Abram to basically get a bunch of animals together and cut them into pieces and lay them on the ground. That sounds really weird to us, but you have to realize that this is an ancient practice back in the day for officially making a covenant. In fact, in Hebrew, the phrase make a covenant is actually to cut a covenant. You would take these animals, you would cut them in pieces, you would lay them on the ground, and basically the two people making the agreement, they would walk between the carcasses of the animals and they would say, may this or worse happen to either of us if we break our end of the deal, right? And so basically it's saying, okay, if I break my end of the deal, you can kill me, right? Just like we cut these animals in half, you can cut me in half, basically. That's what it's communicating. But what God does is he puts Abram into a deep sleep. It's actually the same word that we see, like in Hebrew, it's the same word that we read for God putting Adam into a deep sleep before he made Eve. Right? So it seems like God likes putting people into deep sleeps before he establishes a covenant. Right? Because you have Adam being put into a deep sleep, he wakes up, he meets Eve, they get married. Right? And now here you have Abram being put into a deep sleep, and whenever he wakes up, God is going to be the spouse, in a way. Right? And so Abram goes into a deep sleep, and the main reason Abram goes into a deep sleep is because he is not actually going to pass through the pieces. Instead, God himself is going to pass through the pieces alone. And this is once again God communicating that just like the covenant to Noah, this covenant is unconditional, right? Just no matter what Abram does, God's going to hold his end of the deal. And God is saying, if I don't hold my end of the deal, you can kill me. The thing is it possible to kill God? No. Right? So the idea is that God is saying, I'm going to fulfill my end of the deal no matter what. You can't do anything to break it. Which, it's good that he promises that, because in the very next chapter, Abram's going to test that. Because you'll notice here, in verse 4, Yahweh confirmed Abram's heir will come from his own body. Right? From Abram's body. Who does God not mention in that whole thing?
Sarai.
Sarai, right? Well, if you go to chapter 16, this is something that Sarai seems to catch wind of, because Sarai begins to think that maybe she's the problem, right? They haven't been having a kid, and so Sarai confronts Abram and says, hey, what if you tried having a kid through my maidservant Hagar, right? And I imagine that Sarai said this hoping that Abram would argue back and say, honey, God would never ask me to cheat on you in order to fulfill his promise. Or maybe that he had responded and said, honey, I would never cheat on you. Honey, I love you too much. She was probably hoping that that's how Abram would respond. But instead, this is what we read. Let's see. Verse 2. So Sarai said to Abram, now behold, Yahweh has shut my womb from bearing children. Please go into my servant woman. Perhaps I will obtain children through her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So Abram offers no argument. Sarai's like, hey, I'm an old woman. Here's this young, exotic woman from Egypt who's probably attractive. You should go sleep with her. And Abram says, sign me up. And he goes and does it, right? He shemas his wife, right? He listens. He hears her and he acts based off her words. He probably should not have done that. But as a result of Abram sleeping with Hagar, he does have a child. And this child is a child that he names Ishmael. And very quickly, Sarai is bitter, right? Sarah is upset because Hagar begins to get kind of cocky, right? Hagar begins to kind of treat her Sarai with contempt because from Hagar's perspective, she was a slave, but she was able to give Abram what Sarai could not, right? And so Hagar begins to act very haughtily, right? Very proud. And so Sarai gets mad and she goes to Abram and says like, hey, Abram, what the heck, man? This is unacceptable. And Abram just seems like he does not want to deal with any of this. First off, he should not have listened to Sarai, right? He's just been faithful to his wife and faithful to God. But now that he's done this, he really should protect Hagar, right? Because Hagar is kind of the innocent victim in all of this, even if she is acting kind of cocky. Abram should have protected Hagar, but instead, Abram's just trying to bring peace. And so he's like, you know what, Sarai, do whatever you want. And so Sarai actually runs Hagar off. Right, and she makes Hagar go off and leave. But once again, God is faithful, and so God actually shows up to Hagar and says, "Hagar, I'm going to take care of you. And in fact, since I made a promise to Abram, I'm going to bless your child as well." Right? Abram messed up, but I'm going to be faithful to my promise, and I did not specify which of Abram's seed I would bless, and so I'll bless Ishmael as well. But he won't be as, he's not going to be the promised seed, right? He will be blessed. He's going to be more of a violent man. He's going to be a nomad, but I will make him into a great nation as well. Which then leads us to Genesis 17. This will be the last chapter we cover for today. Genesis chapter 17 is where God has to show up, and now he has to be even more specific with Abram because Abram's messed up, hasn't he? Yep. Right? And so, whenever you get to Genesis 17, this is what we read. Now, it happened that when Abram was 99 years old, 99, how many years have passed since Abram first came to the land of Canaan?
I'm not sure.
How old was he whenever it first started?
75.
75. So if he's 99 now, how many years have passed? Was that? 24. 24 years have passed. Wow. And now, at this point, Ishmael is already a teenager, right? And so you can understand why maybe Abram was getting a little bit impatient. Right? Because here he's received this promise, and he hasn't received a lick of any of... I guess he has been blessed, and his name has become more great, but he hasn't actually had a single child according to God's design.
Because of the whole faith situation.
Well, yeah, exactly. God's testing him, right? 24 years have passed. Yahweh appears to Abram and says to him, I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, so that I may confirm my covenant between me and you, and that I may multiply you exceedingly. And Abram fell on his face, and God spoke with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you will be a father of a multitude of nations. You will no longer be called Abram, but your name will be called Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. God changes Abram's name here, and I think it's funny why he does it. So Abram's name in and of itself means exalted father. Abraham means father of a multitude, or father of a horde. I think this is fitting because previously he just promised to make Abram exalted. But then Abram decided to go and have a kid with another woman, And God promised to bless that child as well. And so God shows up and says, Abram, I'm going to have to change your name now because you're no longer going to be the father of a nation. You're going to be father of a multitude of nations. Because so basically Abram's name change comes as a result of his sin, right? And sure enough, so his wife's name change will also come as a result of his sin, right? I don't know what Sarai itself means. People debate about that. But Sarai's name is going to be changed to Sarah, right? And the name Sarah means princess, right? Because what God is articulating is that the child will come from Sarah's body as well, right? Sarah, like if Abram is the prince of the nation, Sarai or Sarah will be the princess, right? It will not be Hagar. It will not be any other woman. Basically, this is where God shows up and says, did I stutter? Right? He's like, Abram, buddy, you were supposed to understand whatever I said from your own body, I meant from Sarah's as well. And really, Abram should have understood this, right? Because according to Genesis chapter 2, whenever man and woman get married, the two become what?
One flesh.
One flesh, right? And so if God says the seed will come from your own body, it's implied that it will come from your wife because the two have become one.
Yeah.
Right? And so actually, Abram broke that whenever he went and slept with somebody else. Right? And so God shows up and says, Abram, you messed up, and so now you're not going to be the father of one nation, you're going to be the father of a multitude of nations. And this will be fulfilled in many different ways, both through Ishmael and then also through Jacob and Esau and then all sorts of stuff like that, and Abram's other kids that he ends up having. But he says Sarah is going to be the princess, right? The child will come from Sarah. And if you read through Genesis 17, we're not going to go verse by verse, but what we see here is we see that God really lays out the rest of just the things we need to know about this covenant, right? First off, who did God make the covenant with? First off, he makes it directly with Abraham, but more broadly, he makes it to Abraham's seed, which we read in verses 6 and 7, and it's specifically going to be through his child, who God specifies is going to be named Isaac, right? And so Abram's going to have other children as well, right? But the covenant that God makes to Abraham is specifically through Isaac. And as we're going to see, it's going to be through Jacob as well whenever we get to that part of the story. That's why whenever I was saying that those graphs applied to Israel, it's because God here in chapter 17 specifies specifically who the covenant is to, right? So yes, God is going to bless Abram generally through Ishmael and stuff as well, but the promised seed and the promised blessing is specifically going to come through Isaac, right? So the covenant is specifically through that line. What promise did God make? Well, in verse 8, he says he's going to be their God, right? So he's the God of creation, and all these other nations have their own gods, but God says, I'm going to be your God, right? This is the very first time that we see that type of phrase showing up, right? It's one that we take for granted, right? I'll be your God, you'll be my people, right? Verse 8 is the first time he says, I am going to be the God of Israel. When people hear of Yahweh, the God of creation, they're going to know that Yahweh is the God of you, right? The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. That's why he's called that. He also promises to give them land, seed, and blessing, right? Those are the three things you need to remember in regards to the Abrahamic covenant, right? He promises to give them land of Canaan forever, right? That's always going to be theirs, no matter what. No matter what they do, that's going to happen. He promises to give them seed, a huge family. He promises to bless them, and he promises to bless all the world through them, specifically through the promised seed who shows up to crush the serpent, right? And so those are the promises God makes. And the sign that God gives them, remember how he gave a sign to the Noahic covenant? What was the sign of the covenant to Noah?
The bow.
The bow. Well, to Abraham, he gives another sign, and the sign is circumcision. There's plenty of different reasons why circumcision could be the sign. Just to name a few very briefly. One of them is because you're having to cut away part of yourself, right? And so it does cost you something. Like, yes, the covenant's unconditional, but you have to cut away part of yourself in order to receive it, right? And also, I think a big aspect of it is that it is an external sign that is not visible to everybody else, right? It's not like, it's not like everybody else is going to be telling people to lift up their skirts so they can see whether they're circumcised, right? That'd be very inappropriate, right? Instead, this is something that you are having to externally do, but it is one of the most private things, right? So this covenant affects you in the most private ways that only the most intimate of relationships are going to see, right? Really, it's only going to be your spouse that would see it, right? But the covenant goes that deep, right? It is a covenant that requires true devotion, right? And in many ways, it kind of represents a marriage covenant, right? And then once again, it is unconditional, right? That's all laid out in Genesis 17. So, really, I guess you could say that today, what we've covered is really two covenants, right? We covered the Noahic covenant at the beginning, and then the Abrahamic covenant here, right? And both of those covenants really shape things going forward into the rest of the story. And starting next week, we will head into Genesis chapter 18, where we will begin to see the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Sound good?
Yes.
All right, good. I think we covered a good amount of stuff today, and that gets us back on track to where I would like to be, so that we can hop back in next week. Sound good? All right. Dear Lord, thank you so much for allowing us to be here today. We praise you for your word. We thank you for giving it to us. Please guide us as we leave here tonight and go back out into the world. Give us wisdom and discernment to conduct ourselves how you would have us conduct ourselves. And since it's supposed to get extra cold soon, God, keep us all safe. We love you. We praise you. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.